Hey everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today, Amanda, we're going to talk about two tales of murder inspired by books that recently came into the sort room right here at the Scholar. Now, these are two trials I knew nothing about, one of which was an international sensation, and the other of which is still hotly debated even today, and was written about by the American Agatha Christie from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, let's start with the first book, shall we? Now, I recently purchased a lot of books at auction. They were uncatalogued, they were just older books. And among those books was this book, which fascinated me because of its incredible title. It is the Memoirs of Madame Manson, explanatory of her conduct on the trial for the assassination of M. Fualdès, written by herself, for her mother, translated from the French, and accompanied by an abstract of the trial. So, you know, that's going to be good, right? And you see it was published in 1822, and it comes with this beautiful lithograph here of Madame Manson. Now, you've heard of the Manson murders of modern, but you probably have not heard of Madame Manson, partly because this story, while still debated about in France, has now sort of been lost to an American audience. But this was the English translation of the book that Madame Manson wrote, justifying her conduct while in prison for murder. So let's talk a little bit about the Fualdès affair. Fualdès, this happened in 1817, Amanda, so this is after Napoleon, during a time of great turmoil, debate between royalists and those who supported the Republic in France. Fualdès had been a prosecutor and a Bonapartist. He had been somebody who was very, very powerful, and he had a lot of enemies. So, you know, maybe not a surprise that somebody like that would be murdered, but his body turned up in a river with his throat slit, and it was absolutely sensational at the time, partly because of the grisly nature of the murders. It was argued that he had been bled to death, and his blood had been fed to pigs, and children had had to witness this. I mean, the whole thing was extraordinary. At any rate, the police rounded up a number of suspects, actually over a dozen suspects. They had the innkeepers where Fualdès was seen. They had some of Fualdès' relatives that stood to benefit financially. They had other unsavory characters, and they had the impeccable or unimpeachable daughter of a local judge by the name of Madame Manson, who claimed to have witnessed the murder, witnessed Fualdès getting his throat slit. And they brought them all to trial, and this was really the first internationally sensational murder trial. And part of it was because the press picked it up and was able to illustrate the trial with a new invention called lithography. And this is a little different. Prior to this point, in about 1817, if you wanted an illustration for a book, you had to engrave it. We've shown on By Day before copperplate engravings or woodblock engravings. They take a little bit of time. But now with lithography, you could essentially draw it and then mass produce the drawing. So it allowed the court reporters, Amanda, to go into court, make the drawings of all these unusual people, including Madame Manson, and then mass produce the images of the trial. And that made it so much more captivating, right? This is something that'll become commonplace by the time of the Jack the Ripper trial, but at the time in France it was a new novelty. So people were buying and trading the lithographs of the various characters. They were pointing to their moles and defects and saying, well, this one looks guilty, this one looks guilty. What's amazing about the trial, though, is that they just basically arrest everybody because they have no idea exactly who was in on it. But Madame Manson claims to know. She claims to know. And when they get to the trial, the reason she has to justify her conduct, well, let me just explain to you. Every time they ask her, okay, tell your story, who did it? This is what happens. Madame M. threw an expressive glance on the prisoners and fainted away. She was carried out of court to a terrace before the palace. The most anxious attendants were lavished upon her. There she recovered her senses, but fell into the most violent convulsions. Rid my sight of these assassins! She repeated the exclamation several times. The sitting was suspended. She goes back. She faints again. She screams. She points she faints again. And it gets so frustrating to the magistrate and the judges, because she refuses to actually pin the blame on any, that the first trial ends in a sort of partial conviction of a couple of the people, and they have to go to a second trial, and she is indicted for murder as one of the conspirators for the second trial. And it is while in jail she writes this book. She is not sentenced to death, but several people are sentenced to death. To this day, we don't know who murdered Fualdès. But in France, it's still the source of much speculation. There was a recent story, a book that was written that basically said Fualdès knew about a royalist coup to sort of come back into power, and that's why he was killed. We don't know, but we do know that it was covered in the United States, it was covered in Russia, it was covered in England. Copies of Madame Fualdès' memoirs were published, and it was really the first mass media covered murder trial, and it coincided with the invention of lithography, which is pretty cool. So amazing stories you can find in a book. But the main story today is actually about the American Agatha Christie, who was a woman by the name of Mary Roberts Rinehart. Have you ever heard of Mary Roberts Rinehart,
No.
Amanda? Well, she was a great mystery writer during the golden age of mystery. This is between the World War I and World War II, same time as Agatha Christie, just in the United States. Bestseller. She sold millions of copies of her murder mysteries. She wrote plays like Agatha Christie as well. Her books were just extremely, extremely popular. Yet today, she's not remembered. And the real question is, well, why is Agatha Christie remembered, but Mary Roberts Rinehart pretty much entirely forgotten? And there's some different explanations for it. One was that Agatha Christie had those great detectives that went sort of from one story to the next, Hercule Poirot, and Mary Roberts Rinehart didn't have that. Each story was sort of individualized. Secondly, she invented a whole trope of mystery writing. She invented the whole concept of the butler did it, because the butler did it in one of her stories. But she also was heavy on the foreshadowing. Some people say her books were just not as sophisticated because it was the "if only I had known then what I know now" style of mystery writing, with a lot of that in it. But mainly, her stories were about murders that were sort of crimes of passion and mania and things like that. None of which really,
it's less compelling.
But also didn't suit the neatly tied up clues and in the Sherlock Holmes Agatha Christie tradition. But let's go to this story, because one thing she was famous for was looking for actual murders in the news to help inspire. In this book, The After House is based on an actual murder trial that happened about 20 years before she wrote the book in Boston, Massachusetts, about murders on board a ship called the Herbert Fuller. Now, the Herbert Fuller was an American sailing vessel that was bound for South America with a load of lumber. It had 12 people on board, and after they set off very, very soon after from Boston, 3 people were found murdered by somebody who wielded an axe. The captain, the captain's wife, and the second mate were all killed. Immediately, the remaining survivors, 9, placed their suspicion on one of 3 different characters. There was a young Harvard student who was on the trip to sort of see the world, and he was the one who discovered the bodies. He seemed suspicious because he was a Brahmin and he wasn't like the rest of the crew. There was the first mate, who was sort of a dark-skinned individual who maybe was power hungry and wanted the ship for himself, and that's why he killed the rest of the. And then there was the slightly insane sailor who was piloting the ship. He was at the wheel that night, who didn't have a very good alibi, and who apparently had told other members of the crew that in the past he had killed people. So it was an interesting group. Well, anyhow. The ship pulls into Halifax, Nova Scotia, because that's closer to Boston, with a jolly boat, or carrying the bodies of these 3 murdered individuals in a boat that they're tagging along. They're interrogated by the authorities, and the authorities end up pinning the blame on a man by the name of Brom, who was the first mate. And racism may have been involved. We don't really know, but basically. He is, the others say, in fact, the slightly crazy guy who was at the wheel says he saw Brom do the murders. Now, Brom's defense is he couldn't have seen me do the murders because if he was at the ship's wheel, he had no way of seeing him, and this was seen as incriminating, actually. But yeah, I know. Well, he's like, well, that must be an admission that you did the murders. But at any rate, Brom is condemned to life in prison, and he sits there for 20 years. But eventually, Mary Roberts Rinehart it just is, she's captivated by the story that she remembers in the Boston. She does some research, and she comes to the conclusion, Amanda, that Brom was innocent. It was really the other guy who was at the ship's wheel, and she writes the After House about the story. And the only main change is she puts it aboard a yacht, and she gives the Harvard graduate some, romantic. It becomes sort of gentrified with romantic interest, but it's still an axe-wielding triple murder, and she's very proud of that. She's like, I brought the body count up in this book. Incidentally, before I tell you the conclusion, this is an interesting thing in the world of books, because this is the first edition that was published here. I'll show you by Houghton Mifflin in 1914. But at the time, it was very common. Publishers would enter into agreements with reprint publishers to mass produce their books. So Houghton Mifflin would produce the quality version of the book, and then a company like Burt, or maybe you've heard of Glossop and Dunlop or Stokes, or one of these other companies would, in arrangement with Houghton Mifflin, they would publish what was essentially the book club version. We have this today, right? We've got the regular version, the book club version, and one of the reasons you can tell it's a book club version rather than the real version tends to be the quality of the paper. And even in this one today, I'm going to show you something which is sort of neat. If you put them side by side, you see how the boards on the first edition are much thicker and stronger. Can you tell?
A little bit.
Like I cannot bend this book, but look, I can bend this book, right? It's sort of almost paperback. Now it looks like it's nicer because it's in better condition today. But also when you're trying to buy these books online, be wary of whether or not you have the real first edition. If you ever have a book from one of the reprint publishers, you don't actually have the first edition. This is considered the first edition, although they both have the same published, on the copyright page. It's the same. It's the same information, pretty much, but one is done. So they would have been printed at the same time, and then different title page and different boards. Okay.
The more you know.
Back to our story. Hey, this is about books and the book trade. At any rate, this is the best part. All right, Mary Roberts Rinehart is at the height of her fame. She writes the story. She changes the names. She says Brom's innocent. It's really Charlie. It's really this other sailor. And you know who's a big fan of Mary Roberts Rinehart? This is somebody who keeps appearing again and again in our buy days. It's Teddy Roosevelt.
I was going to say.
Well, the answer is always Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt reads the After House and says, Mary, you're absolutely right. He's got to be innocent. I can't believe it.
Wow.
And he says, I'm going to call Woodrow. And Teddy Roosevelt calls Woodrow Wilson and says, you got to pardon this guy. And believe it or not, Woodrow Wilson pardons Bram. Yes. We talk about presidential pardons today and how controversial they are.
Yeah.
Well, apparently you can pardon a triple murdering, axe-wielding maniac.
Don't give Fox
News totally
any
fine
ideas.
because you've read the book and you know that he wasn't on the yacht.
Wow.
Well, that's how powerful Mary Rinehart was. And, the American Agatha Christie from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now you know. But there's one last little thing which is fascinating. Occasionally we'll get letters into the Scholar and manuscripts and just other bits of printed memorabilia. It just happens. And I found this letter in a pile of other paper. It is just remarkable. This is a letter written, can you see? It's to the chief of police in Boston. It was mailed from Halifax, Nova Scotia on July 30th, 1896, which is the same. Now, don't ask me how this, ended up, it's postmarked. So it was received in Boston by the chief of police. It's written by a person in Halifax saying, I know why the murders occurred. It's sort of like the Jack the Ripper. Are you familiar with the Dear Boss letter?
Yep.
Of course, that was written in red ink to signify blood, and it claimed to be Jack the Ripper. This guy does not claim to be the murderer. But it's from a time when, people would constantly be writing in, inspired by what they're reading in the papers and trying to help law enforcement. Anyhow, he says the real reason that the captain, his wife, and the second mate were murdered is because it was actually a conspiracy to smuggle ammunition to the Cuban rebels.
Oh my gosh!
And they had hidden the ammunition amongst the lumber that was the captain thought he was delivering. It was, and the captain discovered this and then had to be silenced. We were about to enter into the Spanish-American War. There was another famous ship from Maine, the the Herbert Fuller was built in Maine, but the Maine itself was bombed, and we go to war on the side of the Cuban rebels. So was this connected? It's a very confusing letter, and there's no proof. But it does show you that, like, evidence can potentially appear. Even later, it talks about Brom. It talks about all the people, and what a neat letter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell the letter with the first edition of the books, and we're going to end with a funny book. Amanda, are you like me? Do you like watching, Acorn or BritBox TV and watching British murder
I have the
mysteries?
Box set of Poirot at home.
Yeah. Okay, so you understand that, especially in England, there's this genre.
Yes.
And if you watch Inspector Morse or Endeavour or Spectre, you know that in certain towns in Britain, there's just a preposterously large number of murders.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so an author has helped us with this. She has discovered that, in fact, you probably need a guide to avoid getting murdered if you're going to visit some of these places in England. I can't tell you the number of shows that are just murder after murder after murder. At any rate, this is a great book. It tells you how to go to all these great places like Oxford, but avoid being murdered by not falling into, making the same foolish mistakes that everybody makes. It's filled with quizzes. It gives you a lot of information about places to avoid and things to go. But it gives you quizzes like, all right, so you make it to the front door. Jeeves takes your bags. He directs you to the library where the family's having a drink before dinner. What do you do?
Take a drink?
No, of course you don't take a drink, Amanda. You'll be poisoned in the library. You follow Jeeves up to the room. No, you don't do that either. No. There's practical tips on how to avoid being murdered. But apparently you're going to need to read this book before your next visit to England. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these stories today. I hope you watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.